Sip. Everybody, how you doing? Back again. So today's video is called Kabbalah versus Tantra. So this is pretty interesting stuff in my opinion. And I'm going to reiterate one of the recurring themes that I keep coming back to, which is how the modern world is defined by the sphere of psychological operations and psychological warfare. And what that means is where our world of my grandparents' generation, prior to nuclear weapons and stuff like that, it was very much a kinetic warfare model of, sort of global geopolitics and, global economics was kind of defined by projecting military ballistic force on the human sphere in terms of nations, right? Whereas in the post-World War II era, everything is about psychological warfare. And so that's how the masses are controlled, through media, through propaganda, through psychological conditioning, through the education system, and so on. In essence, so as I've stated in many previous videos, there's a certain worldview that propagates the idea that the world we live in is multiple. We're focused down here on the bottom level. That's where all our actions and all our values are fixated on material goods and products, and how to obtain products and how to sell products, how to barter with products and stuff like that. And, that's where we focus all of our attention. But in reality, that's the bottom end of the causal chain. And this is something they realize. And the other thing about that is, if you think in terms of density, right? Like trying to walk in mud versus trying to just float in empty space, right? It's much easier in the empty space, right? But the problem is, due to conditioning, all our faculties are focused on mud, right? They're focused on working with things in the material world, which is fine. That's not inherently bad. But my point is, you can apply a much, much less force, like maybe 1% of the same amount of force, time, and energy applied on these higher planes can have, so much effect. And this is what they realize. And they realize, okay, well, instead of trying to physically chain and shackle people or push them around at the barrel of a gun, right? We can just start seeding the consciousness of humanity with the sort of, infrastructure that we want to produce the world of the future. And so that's what they started doing. And, again, I'm going to briefly reference something I keep coming back to, which is time control technology. Okay. The first instance of that in the modern world was this thing called the Chronovisor, which is supposedly invented at the Vatican. But basically what this allows is to basically sort of remote view events in different timelines, right? So a lot of what we're looking at now is propagandistic versions of history. So retelling history to redefine the world in a selected viewpoint versus how it actually went down. And by doing so, it's almost the same as just changing the past, but they can actually exert influences on different timelines. It's very complicated and very confusing. So I'm not going to go too deep into that, but, think Back to the Future on Back to the Future, but instead of Doc Brown and Marty McFly, it's like, Dr. Evil and fucking Dr. Manhattan or something like that, like super geniuses with high tech, beyond belief, like technology, and also incredible psychological acumen on how to produce the desired effect. And just the same as I was saying about these planes of reality and how you can upstream causality process, like seed things on a much more subtle plane and produce concrete results down the line, right? And so, if you apply that kind of logic, now you're starting to get to understand what I'm saying. So Now let's get back to the topic, Tantra versus Qabalah. So in my awakening process, you know, I was in the GATE program as a child, which is not what people think. Like I mean, at ground level, yes, gifted and talented education, that's accurate, but it's more of this occult type stuff, right? ESP, you know, remote viewing, stuff like that. And like subconscious programming that may not necessarily be remembered by the conscious mind, right? So, you know, I could get into that in detail. I could make many hours long thing about that. But, you know, let's just say certain people are selected either for physical aptitudes in certain type of activities or genetics strictly, because genetics is probably the most coveted science on the planet, and it's not what we're taught. They knew about DNA probably about 100 years prior to what was told. You know, they knew about it long ago, and a lot of people argue, and I tend to believe that actually the Hebrew Bible and Tantra and stuff like that actually is this science of genetic manipulation through vibratory sciences of sound and light. Okay, that's super complicated. And so that's kind of the bridge between Tantra and Kabbalah. That's the thing that there's certain things that they have both in common. However, there's very significant differences between these two systems. So anyway, at a certain point in my researches, you know, I came across this. Okay, so when I was in high school, I wanted to be a writer, right? Basically. And so I was studying symbolism, right? So I got this book in an occult bookstore. Like the one decent store in my whole entire town was this freaky occult bookstore, which you'd be surprised how many small shitty towns have an occult bookstore, because this is something, I don't know, it's a weird world to get into, and people who haven't experienced it would be really perplexed by it. But let's just say, for one thing, these deep world-changing sciences and magic power, like way beyond Harry Potter, like more into the Professor X type realm, like this shit is ever present in human reality, and it assumes really inconspicuous forms. And often, you know, a lot of the tropes of the New Age and like the hippie movement, you know, presenting itself as this kind of hippy dippy, like non-threatening weirdos with, you know, flowery clothes and stuff like that. That's like, it's a camouflage, you know, and nothing could be, and, you know, you could apply that equally back to the spiritualist movement of the 1900s and late 1800s, you know, like a gypsy lady with a crystal ball and stuff like that. You know, like most workaday people would never take that with any degree of seriousness. But however, you know, the powers that run the world, you know, that's their bread and butter. That's how they control reality, literally. And I know people don't believe that. Okay, I get it. But I'm just going to assume that if you're still listening to this, you're interested, at least you're infotained by what I'm saying, and you find it quirky and funny, and that's fine. I'm still going to keep telling this story. So let's just say, so then the Kabbalah, right? So in the study of symbolism, in the symbolic dictionary, I would be looking up various things that I was curious about, and most of them would relate to me as an individual, because we're all kind of narcissistic, and we all want to learn about ourselves, which is a good thing to some extent, right? As long as it's within proportion. But anyway, so the point is, I started studying these symbols, and I would look, and in every entry it would always have some little, you know, it would go through different traditions. Like it would tell, oh, the Shintos use this symbol for such and so, or, you know, the ancient Taoist would describe this and that, and it would have Kabbalah under everything. And I was like, what the fuck is Kabbalah? Like when I was 17, I had no idea what that was. So start at basic ground level. The word Kabbalah is a Hebrew word, starts with a Q. We'll come back to that. Starts with a Q, and it relates with reception. Okay. Sometimes it's translated relative to the concept of an oral tradition. So to receive by ear. So to receive versus like reading something on a page this is receiving it by ear directly from the source, right? Which is interesting. So bridging that gap between Kabbalah and Tantra, so many Buddhist texts start with the phrase, thus I have heard, right? Thus I have heard. There's all kinds of subtlety I could go into with that, but let's just point out that's the first commonality we're going to find between these two things. So that's how I initially studied Kabbalah. Found out about it. Was it through the symbol dictionary? And I was like, interesting, So then, the city where I live now had a much, much larger bookstore and a great variety of occult books. And one of the books that I found was this tiny little book. I think it was by maybe Weiser. There's a couple occult publishers in the U.S. that are really prominent. Weiser is one of them, and Llewellyn is another one. So anyway, they had this tiny book about the Kabbalah and the Tree of Life, and it had this old engraving from, I don't know, probably the 1500s or something like that, with this guy, like an old wizard dude with a hat, and like he's holding this sort of tree of life, basically, with these little circles and these little branches in between. And so I was like, what's this about? And so basically, the basic idea behind the tree of life fragment of Kabbalah has to do with how God has, in this system, the most simplified version of it is that within what we consider as God, right, there's 10 basic facets of the personality. And these are used as an analogy describing the 10 planets, right? 10 spheres, okay? So they have this word Sephirah in Hebrew, which has several meanings. It means a book. Sephir is related, okay? Sphere, our modern word, sphere, is related. And I think it has to do with a book, a story, and a reader. So those three aspects, right? So on the one hand, you have this physical object, right? You have the interpreter of the object, and then you have the internalization of that information on the page in that person's mind. So you see how there's a difference between what's actually written on the page versus the internal experience of the individual who reads the page, right? So that's very critical. So we understand the concept of there's an objective component, there's a subjective component, and there's this kind of entity of interpretation that gets into that, right? So basically, the most important concept to get at right here at the very outset is that something that you normally perceive as singular, the idea of God, has all these different ways in which it would appear, right? Like, let's start with the most basic difference, right? Which defines the tree of life pretty much as the right-hand pillar and left-hand pillar, right? So on the right-hand pillar, depending on, there's all kinds of mix-ups with which is right and which is left, which is an interesting topic in its own. But let's say there's this phrase in the oral tradition that says, God draws his children closer with the right hand and pushes them away with the left. So now you get into this concept. So there's two main personalities on this tree of life, which has to do with the wrathful, judging, punishing God, right? And the merciful, kind, uplifting, supportive God, right? And, you're like, well, how can one God have these two opposite characteristics? Well, now you're starting to get it. Now you're starting to understand the Kabbalah. Okay, so one of the second big breakthroughs for me came when I found this guy, Fritz Springmeier, which, buyer beware with that guy. I'm not going to get into too much detail, but he reveals a lot of super key information to understand this whole system. And one of the facts that he gets into has to deal with fracturing the personality. And he claims and contends that these government programs, or I shouldn't really say government, it's more like occult groups or spy groups or whatever, would use trauma induction to fragment the personality and create alternate personalities. And he said that these systems that they used were based on the schematics of the Kabbalah. So we're almost at 15 minutes, so there's definitely going to have to be a part 2 to this. But let's just say there's two versions.